Welcome to this deep dive
Okay.
into something I know you're fascinated by,
All right.
human nature
Okay.
and the wild world of decision-making.
That's good.
You've given us a really interesting mix of materials to work with here.
Okay.
We've got classic psychology texts,
Mm-hmm.
historical biographies,
Interesting.
even some explorations of power dynamics.
Oh, wow.
It's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, it's a real treasure trove of insights into how people tick,
Exactly.
both ourselves and those around us.
Our mission in this deep dive is to distill the key takeaways from these sources
Great.
and hopefully help you make some wiser choices in your own life.
Okay, so to kick things off,
Yeah.
we need to lay some groundwork by understanding how our minds actually work.
Okay.
We'll start with Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow.
Oh, this book was a game changer for me.
Really?
The whole concept of two systems running the show in our brains,
Yeah,
that's powerful stuff.
it really is.
Yeah.
Kahneman argues that we're constantly toggling between two systems.
Okay.
System one is our fast, intuitive, emotional system.
Yeah.
It's great for quick decisions, but also prone to all sorts of biases.
It's like when you swerve to avoid something in the road before you even have time to think about it.
Exactly.
That's system one in action.
Now, system two is our slower, more deliberate, rational side.
Okay.
It's the one that can step back and analyze things carefully. The problem is, system two is kind of lazy.
Right.
It takes effort to activate it, and we often let system one run the show without even realizing it.
So it's like system one is throwing a party, and system two is the designated driver who's trying to take the keys away before anyone does anything too crazy.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
And because system one is often in the driver's seat,
Yeah.
we're susceptible to all sorts of fascinating cognitive biases that Kahneman describes.
I know, right?
Let's take the anchoring effect, for instance.
Okay.
Have you ever noticed how a starting price can influence your entire negotiation,
Oh, absolutely.
even if it's totally arbitrary?
Like, when you see a ridiculous price tag on something,
Yeah.
and then everything else seems like a bargain in comparison.
That's the anchoring effect in action.
It is.
Kahneman uses this great example of a wheel of fortune.
Okay.
People spin the wheel, which lands on a random number,
Uh-huh.
and then they're asked to estimate things like how many countries are in Africa.
Right?
You'd think the wheel wouldn't matter,
Yeah.
but it totally does.
Yeah.
The random number becomes an anchor,
Right.
influencing their guesses,
Interesting.
even though it's completely irrelevant.
That's wild.
And then there's the possibility and certainty effects,
Yeah.
which completely blew my mind.
For sure.
Kahneman explains how we overestimate tiny chances and underestimate near certainties.
Right. This explains why lottery tickets are so enticing.
Yeah.
We overweigh those tiny odds of winning big.
Right.
And on the flip side,
Yeah.
we often fail to take precautions against more likely risks.
Like,
Perhaps because they feel less vivid or emotionally charged. Think about how much worry people invest in things like terrorism,
yeah.
which statistically is a very low risk for most of us,
True.
compared to something like heart disease,
Right.
which is far more likely, but perhaps feels less dramatic.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
It's like our emotions are distorting our sense of probability.
And speaking of emotions,
Oh, yeah.
we can't forget loss aversion.
Ugh.
Losses sting way more than gains feel good.
I know.
I know I've definitely made some questionable financial decisions based on that one.
I feel that.
You know that feeling when you're holding onto a stock that's plummeting
Oh, yeah.
because you just can't stomach selling at a loss?
Loss aversion is a powerful force.
It is.
It can lead us to hold on to bad investments for too long,
For sure.
avoid risks that could lead to big rewards, and even stay in relationships that are no longer serving us,
Oh, yeah.
just because we're afraid of the pain of ending them.
Okay, so we've got these mental shortcuts and biases baked into our brains, leading to all sorts of irrational behavior.
Right.
But our minds aren't just prone to these logical slip-ups. There's a whole other layer of irrationality we need to explore, and that's where Robert Greene comes in.
Right.
His work,
Yeah.
especially the 48 Laws of Power and the Laws of Human Nature, takes us into some fascinating,
Okay.
albeit uncomfortable, territory.
Greene delves into the darker side of human nature.
Okay.
He exposes those primal urges that often drive our decisions.
Right.
Things like our susceptibility to group emotions.
Yeah.
And our deep-seated need for status and belonging.
Wait, so you're saying we all have this hidden dark side
In a sense, yeah,
that's kind of scary, but also really intriguing.
it is.
What exactly is this shadow he talked about?
So the shadow is a term used in psychology
Okay.
to describe those repressed desires and darker impulses that we often don't even want to admit to ourselves.
Right.
It's the part of us that feels envy, resentment, anger, and lust. Emotions that we often try to push down or ignore because they make us uncomfortable.
So Greene is arguing that if we want to understand ourselves and others truly, we need to acknowledge this shadow and learn how to navigate it.
Exactly. He's not condoning these darker impulses.
Right.
He's saying that by understanding them, we can become more self-aware and make more conscious choices.
Okay.
Greene uses these incredible historical and biographical examples to illustrate his points.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about these examples.
Sure.
How does he connect all of this to real-life situations?
Well, one of the examples he uses is the South Sea bubble.
Okay.
It's a classic case of how the lure of easy money and the fear of missing out fueled a speculative frenzy.
Interesting.
Thousands of people poured their savings into a company that was essentially built on hype and speculation.
Sounds a lot like some of the recent market bubbles we've seen.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is how Greene connects this historical event to our own psychology.
Okay.
He argues that the South Sea bubble wasn't just about greed.
Right.
It was also about our deep-seated need for belonging and status. People were so afraid of being left out of this get-rich-quick scheme that they threw caution to the wind.
So it's like our primal emotions can hijack our rational thinking when we're caught up in the frenzy of a crowd.
That's one way to put it.
Okay.
And it's not just about financial decisions either.
Right.
We see these dynamics play out in all sorts of social situations.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense, but it's also a little unsettling.
Yeah.
If we're all running around with these hidden shadows and susceptible to manipulation, it makes you wonder if we're even capable of making truly rational decisions.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's one that Greene grapples with in his work.
Okay.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
He doesn't want us to feel powerless. In fact, he argues that understanding these darker aspects of human nature can actually be empowering.
Really?
It's like shining a light on the monsters under the bed.
Okay.
Once you see them, they lose a lot of their power to scare you.
So instead of being afraid of our shadow selves,
Right.
we can learn to manage them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Greene provides some really practical advice on how to do that.
Like what?
One of his key strategies is developing self-awareness.
Okay.
The more we understand our own shadow,
Yeah.
the less likely we are to be controlled by it.
That makes sense.
Right.
But how do we even start to become aware of something that's hidden by definition?
It takes practice
Okay.
and a willingness to be honest with ourselves. We can start by paying attention to our emotional reactions.
Okay.
What triggers our anger, our envy, our resentment.
Right.
Once we start to identify those triggers, we can begin to understand the underlying motivations.
So it's like becoming a detective of our own emotions.
Right.
I like that.
And another key skill Greene emphasizes
Okay.
is cultivating a more rational and objective mindset,
Okay.
especially in high-stakes situations.
Okay, that sounds like a good idea in theory,
Yeah,
but it's got to be hard to stay rational when you're in the heat of the moment, right?
it is.
Especially when those primal emotions are kicking in.
It definitely takes practice,
Okay.
but one helpful technique
Yeah.
is to simply pause before reacting.
Okay.
Take a few deep breaths and ask yourself,
Yeah.
what's really going on here? Am I being triggered by something?
Right.
Is my shadow in the driver's seat?
Okay.
That simple act of pausing can create enough space for your system to kick in and make a more conscious choice.
I love that.
Yeah.
Like hitting the pause button on your emotions so you
Yeah.
can assess the situation more clearly.
Exactly.
And speaking of assessing situations, Greene also talks about the importance of learning to read people's nonverbal cues.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost like becoming a human lie detector.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nonverbal communication can be incredibly revealing.
Right.
It can tell you a lot about someone's true emotions and motivations, even if they're trying to hide them.
Yeah.
Greene provides a ton of tips on how to decode body language,
Okay.
facial expressions, and even tone of voice.
This would be so helpful in all sorts of situations.
Yeah.
Negotiating a salary, navigating office politics, even just having a difficult conversation with a friend or family member.
Yeah.
If you can read between the lines of what someone is saying,
Yeah.
you can respond in a much more effective way.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And finally,
Yeah.
Greene delves into the art of persuasion.
Okay.
He argues that one of the most effective ways to persuade someone is to appeal to their deep-seated need for validation and security.
It's funny because we often think of persuasion as being about logic and arguments.
Right.
But Greene is saying it's actually much more emotional.
Right. Interesting.
He's not talking about manipulating people.
Right. But rather understanding what truly motivates them.
Right.
We all want to feel valued,
Yeah.
appreciated, and safe.
For sure.
So if you can speak to those core needs and desires,
Yeah.
you're much more likely to persuade someone.
This is all starting to feel like a masterclass in navigating the social world.
Yeah.
But I also want to be mindful of not using this knowledge to take advantage of others.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Ethical considerations are crucial here.
Right.
Greene himself cautions against using these insights for malicious purposes.
Okay.
The goal is to become more effective communicators and build stronger relationships,
Yeah.
not to manipulate or control others.
Right.
It's about using this knowledge for good,
Okay.
both for ourselves and for the people around us.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about our dual systems of thinking, the shadow self,
Yeah.
the power of primal emotions,
Right.
and how all of this plays out in real-life situations.
Exactly.
But I'm curious, what happens when we blend these insights from Kahneman and Greene?
Okay.
How do cognitive biases and those primal emotions work together?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Remember the South Sea bubble example we talked about?
I could do.
That wasn't just about group dynamics and the fear of missing out.
Okay.
It was also a prime example of cognitive biases in action.
You mean like the availability bias?
Exactly.
Where we tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy to recall.
Right. The stories of people getting rich quick were circulating everywhere,
Right.
making it seem like success was inevitable.
Uh-huh.
This availability of those stories skewed people's judgment,
Yeah.
making the investment seem less risky than it actually was.
Right.
And then there's the confirmation bias, where
Right.
we tend to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Yeah.
Even if those beliefs are flawed.
Right.
People who were already convinced that the South Sea Company was a sure thing were likely to ignore any evidence to the contrary.
So it's like a perfect storm of cognitive biases and primal emotions,
It is.
all fueling this irrational exuberance.
Yeah.
And Greene doesn't shy away from exploring how these same forces can play out in much darker scenarios as well.
Right.
He uses the example of the Cultural Revolution in China,
Right.
a horrific period of violence and social upheaval.
That's a chilling example of how a charismatic leader can exploit our need to belong,
Yeah.
manipulate group dynamics, and unleash devastating violence.
Wow.
Greene argues that Mao Zedong skillfully tapped into people's fears and resentments,
Okay.
framing himself as the savior of the nation
Right.
while demonizing anyone who questioned his authority.
It's terrifying to think about how easily our basic human needs can be twisted and exploited.
It is.
But I guess that's why it's so important to understand these forces. If we
Right.
can see how they're being used against us,
Yeah,
we're less likely to fall prey to manipulation.
exactly.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
And understanding the psychology behind these events can help us avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.
It all comes back to self-awareness, doesn't it?
It does.
The more we understand about ourselves and the forces that shape our behavior,
Yeah,
the more effectively we can navigate the world.
absolutely.
Right.
And the more we can use that knowledge to create a more just and compassionate society.
Wow. This deep dive has been a roller coaster.
Yeah.
We've gone from the inner workings of our minds to the shadowy depths of human nature and back again.
Right.
It's been fascinating,
It has.
but I gotta admit,
Yeah.
it's also a little heavy.
I know what you mean.
It makes you wonder if we're ever really in control of our own decisions.
It's true that these forces,
Yeah.
both the cognitive biases and the primal emotions,
Yeah.
are powerful.
Right.
And they can often lead us astray.
Right.
But the good news is
Yeah.
that simply being aware of them gives us a fighting chance to overcome them.
So like just knowing about this stuff can help.
Yeah.
Remember, knowledge is power.
So instead of feeling like victims of our own psychology,
Right.
we can use this understanding
Yeah.
to become more conscious and intentional in our choices.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
And Greene offers some really empowering advice
Okay.
on how to do that.
Like what?
He talks about the importance of developing a more objective and rational attitude,
Okay.
particularly in those high-stakes situations where our emotions are running high.
Okay, but how do we actually do that?
Right.
It's one thing to say, be more rational,
Yeah.
but it's another thing to actually pull it off when you're feeling stressed,
Yeah.
angry, or afraid.
It's definitely a skill that takes practice.
Right.
One technique Greene suggests is to try to step outside of yourself
Okay.
and view the situation from a more detached perspective.
Okay.
Imagine you're an impartial observer, watching the events unfold as if they were happening to someone else.
That's interesting.
It's like creating some psychological distance so you can see things more clearly.
Right.
Okay.
And another helpful strategy is to cultivate a sense of emotional resilience.
Okay.
The more we can tolerate uncomfortable emotions without letting them control us, the better equipped we'll be to make rational decisions, even under pressure.
So it's not about suppressing those emotions, but rather learning to manage them more effectively.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's about finding that sweet spot between being aware of our emotions and not letting them hijack our decision-making process.
This whole conversation has really highlighted the importance of self-awareness.
It has.
The more we understand about our own motivations, biases, and triggers, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the complexities of human interaction.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And it's not just about understanding ourselves. It's also about developing empathy for others. Recognizing that everyone is grappling with these same forces can help us approach relationships with more compassion and understanding.
It's like we're all in this together.
Yeah.
Trying to navigate the messy, beautiful, often confusing world of human experience.
Exactly.
And having a little insight into the psychology behind it all.
Yeah.
Can make the journey a bit smoother.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And remember, it's not about achieving some kind of perfect rationality.
Right.
We're all human.
Yeah.
And we're all going to make mistakes.
For sure.
The key is to learn from those mistakes and keep striving to make choices that are aligned with our values and goals.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's about progress.
Right.
Not perfection.
Exactly.
And it's about using this knowledge to create a better life for ourselves and for those around us.
For sure.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what's one final thought you want to leave our listener with?
Well, we've talked a lot about how our minds can deceive us and how easily we can be swayed by those primal emotions.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that we also have the capacity for incredible good.
Okay.
We can choose to act with kindness, generosity, and courage, even when it's difficult.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's up to each of us to decide what kind of person we want to be and what kind of impact we want to have on the world.
That's a beautiful and empowering message.
Thanks.
So, to our listener, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of human nature.
Exactly.
The more we understand about ourselves,
the
more we can unlock our full potential for good.
And never underestimate the power of your own choices.
Oh.
Every decision you make, no matter how small, shapes who you are and the world around you.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time.
Okay.
Keep those brains buzzing.